In hushed, fearful tones, the German immigrant community of Milwaukee, Wisconsin whispered about 11-year-old Emma Richter during the winter of 1873. This quiet, pale child could, within seconds, calculate the day of the week for any date in history. After hearing them just once, she could memorize entire conversations word for word, and she could recite the precise number of steps between any two buildings in her neighborhood. To the people of 1873, what modern science might recognize as an extraordinary neurological condition was either a divine blessing or something far more sinister. But the community's amazement turned to terror when Emma began using her remarkable abilities to reveal buried secrets, predict deadly accidents, and recite intimate details of crimes that supposedly no living person had witnessed. 3 men would be dead by spring. A family would flee in the night, and Emma Richter herself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a leather journal filled with numbers that no one dared to decode. Before we continue with the dark secrets uncovered by Emma Richter's extraordinary mind in Milwaukee's German Quarter, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, we bring you the most haunting historical mysteries. Let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happen in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. What the residents of Brewery Town didn't realize was that a web of lies, betrayal, and murder, carefully hidden for nearly a decade, would be exposed by Emma's gift, and that her mathematical precision would become their community's most terrifying nightmare. A bustling enclave of red brick breweries, modest wooden homes, and the constant sound of German voices mixing with English in the crisp Wisconsin air was Milwaukee's German Quarter in 1873. Their own little Bavaria had been built along the shores of Lake Michigan by the community of nearly 8,000 German immigrants, complete with beer gardens, traditional bakeries, and the familiar rhythms of old-world life transplanted to American soil. While their wives tended gardens that yielded the same vegetables their grandmothers had grown in the Rhineland, the men worked in the breweries, Schlitz, Best, and the dozens of smaller operations that made Milwaukee famous. With dreams of prosperity and their infant daughter, Emma, Heinrich and Greta Richter had arrived from Bavaria in 1861. Steady work as a brewmaster at the Kellner Brewery was found by Heinrich, a mid-sized operation that supplied beer to the growing city's thirsty population. To supplement their income, Greta took in laundry and mending, her nimble fingers working by candlelight long after Emma had been put to bed in their small but tidy home on Galena Street. In every way except for their daughter, the Richters were unremarkable. So small that the ship's doctor doubted she would survive the journey, Emma had been born during the harsh Atlantic crossing, 3 weeks premature. But survive she did, though she remained slight and pale with enormous gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unsettling intensity. Rarely crying or demanding attention as a toddler, she was content to sit quietly in corners, watching and listening as the adult world unfolded around her. Something unusual was begun to be noticed by Emma's parents by age 4. Entire conversations she had overheard days earlier could be recited by her, complete with the precise inflections and accents of the speakers. She counted everything, the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the steps from their front door to the bakery, the exact time between the brewery whistles that marked the beginning and end of each workday. When Heinrich taught her basic arithmetic, mathematical concepts were absorbed by her with frightening speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could work them out on paper. A mixture of pride and unease was how the German community initially viewed Emma's abilities. Whenever Emma's calculating gray eyes fixed on her, old Mrs. Brennan, who claimed to remember the witch trials in her grandmother's stories, crossed herself. But a blessing from God was what Father Koller, the stout Bavarian priest who served their small Catholic parish, declared Emma's gifts to be, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their New World community. Particularly harsh had been the winter of 1872, with temperatures dropping so low that Lake Michigan froze solid for the first time in a generation. While their wives struggled to keep their families warm and fed through the long, bitter months, the brewery workers huddled around coal stoves, their breath visible even indoors. It was during this isolated winter that a darker character began to be taken on by Emma's abilities, though no one yet understood what was coming. The habit of sitting by the small window in their kitchen had been developed by Emma, watching the neighbors go about their daily routines with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems. She began to notice patterns not just in numbers, but in human behavior. Always walking to the brewery by the same route, Mr. Kruger took exactly 247 steps, except on Wednesdays when he took a different path that required 284 steps. In a specific sequence, Mrs. Fisher hung her laundry, but when her husband worked late at the mill, the order was changed by her completely. These observations might have been dismissed as the quirks of an unusual child, except that Emma began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. On a gray February morning in 1873, the transformation from curiosity to dread began. While her mother prepared her father's lunch pail, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, methodically eating her breakfast when she suddenly looked up and announced, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 14 minutes past 2 o'clock." The tin pail she was holding was nearly dropped by Greta. "Emma, mind God, what a terrible thing to say. Why would you think such a thing?" With that unsettling intensity, Emma's gray eyes remained fixed on her mother's face. "For 17 days, he has been drinking from the small brown bottle. 3 times more than usual, he drank yesterday. His steps were uneven, 251 instead of his normal 244. Within 72 hours, something significant happens when people change their patterns by more than 10%. By 12%, Mr. Dietrich's pattern changed. The calculation is simple." Staring at his daughter, Heinrich, who had been putting on his heavy wool coat, stopped. Indeed, a drinker was Jon Dietrich, but no more than half the men in the German quarter. Disturbing enough was the idea that Emma had been counting his steps and tracking his drinking habits, but a chill through both parents was sent by her calm mathematical certainty about his death that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter. "You must not say such things, Emma," Heinrich said firmly. "It's not proper for a child to speak of death." Emma simply nodded and returned to her breakfast, but worried glances were exchanged by her parents over her bent head. They had grown accustomed to their daughter's unusual observations, but this felt different, darker and more specific than her typical mathematical pronouncements. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 that afternoon, Jan Dietrich collapsed in the brewery's malt room. Heart failure brought on by what Dr. Mayer determined to be chronic alcohol poisoning was the official cause of death. The brewery workers who found him noted that he had been acting strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily than usual and showing signs of severe anxiety. But the timing was what truly unsettled them. Accurate to the minute had been Emma Richter's prediction. Through the German quarter like smoke from a chimney fire spread the word of Emma's grim prophecy. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others remembered the pale girl with the calculating eyes and began to wonder what else she might have observed during her silent vigils at the kitchen window. The subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances when they walked to church or visited the market became the Richter family. Less certain now seemed Father Koller, who had previously praised Emma's gifts as divine. Seeking guidance about his daughter's disturbing prediction, when Heinrich approached him after Sunday Mass, the priest's jovial demeanor had been replaced by something approaching concern. "Heinrich, my friend," Father Koller said, his Bavarian accent thick with worry, "perhaps it would be best if young Emma spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her prayers. The Lord gives us gifts, yes, but sometimes the devil can twist even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." Deeply troubled was Heinrich by this suggestion. He had always been a practical man, more concerned with the science of brewing than the mysteries of faith. But the unsettling accuracy of Emma's prediction could not be dismissed by even him. For a serious conversation, he sat his daughter down that evening. "Emma, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Dietrich?" With those enormous gray eyes, Emma looked at her father, her expression as calm and analytical as always. "I watch, I count, I remember." In predictable ways, Mr. Dietrich's behavior changed. Cardiac stress becomes inevitable when someone increases their alcohol consumption by 37% over a 17-day period while simultaneously reducing their food intake by approximately 20%. Based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms, I calculated the most probable time of failure. Cold felt Heinrich his blood run. Like a physician, or something far more troubling was how his 11-year-old daughter was speaking. But Emma, how could you know all these details about Mr. Dietrich's eating and drinking? I observe everything, Papa, every day, every person, every pattern. Emma's voice remained matter-of-fact, but something in her eyes made Heinrich deeply uncomfortable. Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I've made? Quickly, Heinrich shook his head. He did not want to know what else his daughter had calculated about their neighbors' lives and deaths. But as he tucked Emma into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his family was standing at the edge of something much darker than a simple mathematical curiosity. Outside their small house, the February snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the German quarter and creating an insulated world where secrets could be hidden and observations could be made without detection. Quietly in her narrow bed lay Emma, her mathematical mind processing the day's data and calculating probabilities that number 11-year-old should be able to comprehend, and certainly number 11-year-old should want to know. Like the wind off Lake Michigan shifted the atmosphere in Milwaukee's German quarter in the weeks following Jens Dietrich's death. But now with growing unease, her parents watched her as Emma continued her daily observations as she sat by the kitchen window, her gray eyes tracking the movements of their neighbors with mechanical precision. A source of deep, knowing worry had become the child who had once been their pride. Tight-knit by necessity was the brewing community. The men relied on each other for work, their wives for companionship during the long winters, and their children played together in the narrow streets between the red brick buildings. But into this social fabric, Emma had never quite fit. While other children played games and told stories, she preferred to sit alone, counting and calculating and watching the world around her with that unsettling intensity. More detailed and more disturbing were the observations that Greta began to notice Emma's were becoming. Casually, the child would mention that for 6 weeks, Mrs. Weber had been meeting secretly with Mr. Kellner behind the brewery on Tuesday afternoons, or that every Sunday after church, the Schneider family had been burying something in their back garden. When Greta asked how Emma could possibly know such things, the girl would simply explain that she had observed the patterns and calculated the probabilities. "People think they are being secret," Emma said one March morning as she methodically buttered her bread. "But they follow patterns just like numbers. Mrs. Weber always tells her husband she's visiting her sister on Tuesday afternoons, but she takes 127 steps to Mr. Kellner's house instead of 349 steps to her sister's. Exactly 73 centimeters apart in a grid pattern, the Schneiders bury objects wrapped in cloth. They believe no one is watching, but I am always watching." Enough had been heard by Heinrich. That evening, after Emma was asleep, he spoke seriously with his wife about their daughter's increasingly troubling behavior. "Greta, this cannot continue. Unnatural is what Emma is becoming. Such things should not be observed by children, and they certainly should not be spoken of so coldly by them." Nodding, Greta, her hands trembling as she mended one of Heinrich's work shirts. "I'm frightened, Heinrich. Not of Emma, but of what people will think. Already the neighbors look at us strangely. Yesterday, Mrs. Brennan crossed the street when she saw me coming. And Father Collar, he has not visited us since Jan's death." Justified proved their fears when 3 days later, another of her mathematical announcements was made by Emma. Helping her mother prepare dinner, she was when she suddenly stopped peeling potatoes and looked up with that familiar calculating expression. "Mrs. Weber will be discovered tomorrow at 11 in the morning. In the brewery office, her husband will find her with Mr. Kellner. There will be violence." Her paring knife was dropped by Greta. "Emma, mind God, you must not say such things." But with the same mathematical certainty she applied to her arithmetic lessons, Emma continued. "For 6 weeks, Mrs. Weber has been arriving at the brewery 7 minutes earlier each week. Each day, Mr. Kellner has been staying 33 minutes later. Tomorrow, 47 minutes early will be when Mr. Weber returns from his delivery route because her left front leg is developing lameness in his horse. For 11 days, I have observed her gait deteriorating. The convergence of these 3 variables makes discovery inevitable." With dread, Heinrich, who had been listening from the doorway, felt his chest tighten. Their neighbors were not just being observed by his daughter, she was predicting their futures with terrifying accuracy. "Emma, how do you know about Mr. Weber's horse?" "When she passes our house, I count her steps." On March 1st, 53% of the time she favored her right leg. Today, it was 68%. Tomorrow, severe enough to slow the delivery route by 47 minutes will be the lameness, causing Mr. Weber to return early. Exactly as Emma had calculated unfolded the next day. In a compromising position with brewery owner Ernst Kellner, Wilhelm Baer discovered his wife Anna. A broken nose and 3 cracked ribs were left on Kellner by the confrontation that followed, while Anna was beaten so severely that Dr. Müller had to be summoned. The tight-knit German community was rocked by the scandal. But the growing realization that little Emma Richter had somehow predicted the entire sequence of events was what disturbed people even more. Quickly through the neighborhood spread the word. Not only had the pale girl with the mathematical mind predicted Johann Dietrich's death, but with unsettling precision, she had also foreseen the Baer-Kellner scandal. About the strange child who sat at her window, watching and calculating and somehow knowing things that no child should know, people began to whisper. Increasingly isolated found the Richter family themselves. At church, former friends avoided them. Children were forbidden from playing near their house, and with barely concealed suspicion, even the shopkeepers in the German quarter began to treat them. Tenuous became Heinrich's position at the brewery. His fellow workers viewed him with unease, and Ernst Kellner, still recovering from his beating, made it clear that the Richter family was no longer welcome at company social events. But to the growing hostility around her, Emma seemed oblivious. She continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision. A leather journal was begun to be kept by her, filling its pages with numbers, dates, and observations that her parents dared not read. With a dread they could not name, the sight of their 11-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures filled them. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened. Now hostile and threatening seemed the German quarter that had once felt like home. Heinrich began to consider the unthinkable, leaving Milwaukee, abandoning the life they had built, and starting over somewhere far from the whispers and the fear and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But with her calculations, Emma was not finished. The worst was yet to come, and the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all had already been begun to be processed by her mathematical mind. Thicker with her precise notations grew Emma's journal as April arrived in Milwaukee, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter. Her constant companion had become the leather-bound book, and she filled its pages with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics. Charts tracking human behavior patterns, tables of numerical sequences they couldn't understand, and detailed maps of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements were caught glimpses of by her parents. In more concrete ways had the community's fear of Emma begun to manifest. From walking past the Richter house, children were forbidden. Quickly and without conversation, shopkeepers served the family, and even Father Koller had begun limiting his interactions with them to formal church services. But Emma's isolation only seemed to sharpen her observational skills, as if the removal of normal social distractions allowed her unusual mind to focus more intently on the mathematical patterns she perceived in human behavior. Increasingly curious about Emma's abilities had grown Dr. Friedrich Müller, the community's physician. Unlike the superstitious whispers of the neighbors, Dr. Müller approached the situation with scientific interest. He had studied medicine in Berlin before immigrating to America and had encountered cases of unusual mental capabilities in his practice. When Heinrich Richter approached him privately, seeking medical advice about his daughter's condition, Dr. Müller agreed to examine Emma. On a rainy Thursday morning in Dr. Miller's office above the pharmacy on Water Street took place the examination. With the same mathematical precision she applied to everything else, Emma submitted to the doctor's questions and tests, answering each inquiry with detailed accuracy, while her gray eyes remained fixed on some invisible calculation. "Emma," Dr. Müller said in his accented English, "your father tells me you can predict when certain events will happen. Can you explain to me how you do this?" With that unsettling intensity, Emma looked at the doctor. "I observe patterns and calculate probabilities based on established behavioral data. People believe their actions are random, but they follow mathematical sequences. When I have sufficient data points, I can predict future behavior with high accuracy." Intrigued despite himself, Dr. Mueller leaned forward. "Can you give me an example?" Consulting her journal, Emma flipped through pages of neat numerical notations. "Mrs. Brennan believes she is keeping a secret, but her pattern is quite obvious. For 8 weeks, every Tuesday and Friday, she has walked to the church at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. But she continues to the rectory and remains for precisely 43 minutes instead of entering for prayer. Father Kerr's pattern has also changed. He has been purchasing extra candles and wine, and his evening prayers have extended by an average of 17 minutes on Tuesdays and Fridays. The correlation is statistically significant." His breath catch was felt by Dr. Mueller. Scandalous enough were the implications of what Emma was suggesting about the priest and the widow, but deeply troubling was the methodical way she had documented her observations. "Emma, how long have you been watching people in this way?" "Always," Emma replied simply. "Since I was very small, but I only began making calculations when I learned mathematics. The patterns became clearer then." Privately with Heinrich and Greta Richter spoke Dr. Mueller after the examination. That Emma's condition was neurological rather than supernatural was told to him by his medical training, but he had no framework for understanding what he had observed. "Differently than other children's, your daughter's mind works," he explained. "In ways that seem almost mechanical, she processes information. In my opinion, a medical condition is this, not the other things people are saying." But the growing dread that surrounded Emma's predictions couldn't be diminished by even Dr. Mueller's scientific perspective. 2 days after his examination, another of her calculated announcements was made by Emma. "There will be a fire at the Zimmerman house on Sunday evening. It will start at 8:47 and spread to 3 adjacent buildings before the volunteer fire brigade can respond. Mr. Zimmerman will not survive." The familiar chill that accompanied his daughter's predictions was felt by Heinrich. "Emma, you must not say such things. How could you possibly know about a fire?" Her journal was consulted by Emma. "For 12 days, Mr. Zimmerman has been drinking lamp oil mixed with whiskey. I observed him purchasing both items in quantities that exceed normal household use. Which follows the pattern of wives leaving before significant domestic incidents occur. His wife left for Chicago to visit her sister yesterday. Structural damage that I calculated based on the angle of smoke emission and the pattern of soot deposits has the chimney on their house. 93% is the probability of fire." Softly, Greta began to weep. More than any supernatural explanation would have, the clinical way Emma discussed potential tragedy, as if human suffering were simply another mathematical problem to be solved, frightened her. This was her child, but the cold precision in Emma's voice or the mechanical way she processed human pain was no longer recognized by her. A decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life was made by Heinrich. He decided to warn Franz Zimmerman about Emma's prediction, hoping that preventive action might save a life and perhaps demonstrate that for good rather than simply predicting disaster could be used his daughter's calculations. At the brewery Saturday evening, stumbling drunk and reeking of the lamp oil Emma had mentioned, he found Zimmerman. With belligerent laughter and crude jokes about the devil child who thinks she knows everything was met Heinrich's warning. But something in Heinrich's desperation must have penetrated Zimmerman's alcoholic haze because he promised to be extra careful with the lamps. With unseasonable warmth and a dry wind from the west arrived Sunday evening. At exactly 8:47, flames erupted from the Zimmerman house. With terrifying speed spread the fire, consuming not just the original building, but 3 adjacent homes before the volunteer fire brigade could mount an effective response. In his kitchen, where he had apparently fallen while trying to extinguish flames that had spread far beyond his ability to control, was found Brand Zimmerman's body. Through the German quarter sent shock waves the accuracy of Emma's prediction down to the exact minute. By several brewery workers had been witnessed Heinrich's attempt to warn Zimmerman, and word spread quickly that not just the fire, but its precise timing and consequences had been predicted by Emma. into open fear transformed the community's unease, and completely ostracized found the Artur family themselves. But for Emma, simply another data point to be recorded in her journal was the fire. She noted the correlation between her prediction and the actual event, made adjustments to her calculations based on the observed variables, and with the same mechanical precision that had made her prediction possible in the first place, began processing new patterns. That she was not finished calculating was the worst part. Into a place of whispered fears and sideways glances transformed the days following the Zimmermann fire, the German quarter. Too precise, too detailed, and too accurate to be dismissed as coincidence had been Emma's prediction. 3 families, the Brauns, the Kohles, and the Steiners, had lost their homes in the blaze, and the community was struggling to house the displaced families while trying to process the unsettling reality of Emma's mathematical prophecies. Untenable had found Heinrich his position at the brewery. His fellow workers avoided him. When he entered a room, conversations stopped, and Ernst Kellner, still bearing the marks of Wilhelm Baer's attack, made it clear that in any brewery's social functions was no longer welcome the Richter family's presence. From a curiosity into something the community feared to name had their daughter been transformed by the mathematical precision of Emma's predictions. Of the growing hostility around her, Emma herself seemed unaware. She continued her daily observations, filling page after page of her leather journal with calculations that grew increasingly complex and disturbing. What appeared to be probability matrices had been begun to be created by her, tracking multiple variables simultaneously and generating predictions that extended weeks into the future. Afraid to look at her daughter's journal found herself Greta, terrified of what calculations about their own family or neighbors might be being made by Emma. A source of constant anxiety had become the child who had once been her greatest joy. All contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental had been lost or damaged in her daughter's mind. Emma's matter-of-fact discussions of human tragedy, her clinical observations about people's most private behaviors, and her mechanical processing of information that should have evoked emotional responses. On a Tuesday morning in late April came the breaking point. At her usual place by the kitchen window, Emma was sitting, watching the street activity with her characteristic intensity when she suddenly looked up at her mother with those calculating gray eyes. "Mama, there is something wrong with the pattern today." Who was preparing bread for baking, Greta felt her hands begin to tremble. "What do you mean, Emma?" Her journal was consulted by Emma, flipping through pages of numerical notations with practiced efficiency. For 11 weeks, every Tuesday, Mrs. Brennan has walked to the rectory at exactly 3:15. But today, at 2:47 she left her house and walked toward the river instead. Significant distress is indicated by her behavior. By 12% decreased her step length and irregular was her breathing pattern. This suggests she is planning something final. With horror filled Greta the clinical way Emma discussed Mrs. Brennan's apparent suicidal intentions. "Emma, you must not speak of such things. A good woman is Mrs. Brennan. She would never, 87% is the mathematical probability," interrupted Emma with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "Typically execute irreversible decisions within 4 hours of the pattern change people who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while displaying physical signs of distress. 43 minutes ago changed Mrs. Brennan's pattern." Tilting around her felt Greta the world. More than she could bear was the realization that with mathematical precision, her 11-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide. She dropped her bread dough and ran to find Heinrich, who was in their small garden behind the house trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of preparing soil for spring planting. "Heinrich, you must come quickly. Emma says Mrs. Brennan is going to harm herself. We must do something." At his wife's terrified face looked Heinrich and felt the familiar dread that had become their constant companion. Still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her journal as if recording a scientific observation rather than predicting a human tragedy, they found Emma. "Emma, tell me exactly what you observed about Mrs. Brennan." From her calculations looked up Emma. By 28 minutes, she deviated from her established Tuesday pattern. Severe emotional distress was suggested by her physical indicators. 87% is the probability of self-harm based on historical data about behavioral pattern disruption, with peak likelihood occurring between 5 and 7 this evening. That revealed both his desperation and his growing acceptance of Emma's abilities was a decision made by Heinrich. He left the house immediately and went searching for Margaret Brennan, following the route toward the river that Emma had indicated. On the dock were the fishing boats tied up, standing and staring into the dark water with an expression of profound despair, he found the elderly widow. "Mrs. Brennan," called Heinrich softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. "Are you all right?" Toward him turned the elderly woman, her eyes red with tears. "Heinrich, what are you doing here?" I was concerned about you. You seem troubled lately." Crumbled was Mrs. Brennan's face. "I cannot bear it any more, Heinrich. The shame, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone knows about my weakness. Sin, says Father Collar it is, but what I feel for him I cannot help. Better to end it than to live with this disgrace." With growing horror realized Heinrich that accurate had been Emma's observations about Mrs. Brennan and Father Collar, and that indeed contemplating suicide was the elderly woman rather than face the scandal. The next 2 hours spent he talking Margaret Brennan away from the river, convincing her that shame was not worth dying for and that eventually would fade the community's judgment. Making final notations in her journal found he Emma when he returned home that evening. Mrs. Brennan did not follow through with her plan, she observed clinically. The intervention changed the probability calculation. For future predictions involving third-party interference, I will need to adjust my variables. In disbelief stared Heinrich at his daughter. A suicide attempt that had not yet occurred had been somehow observed and calculated by Emma. And now as simply another data point to be incorporated into her mathematical models was being treated by her his intervention. With a horror he could not name filled him the realization that not just predicting tragic events, but studying human suffering with scientific detachment was his 11-year-old daughter. That would change their lives forever was a decision made by Heinrich and Greta that night as Emma slept peacefully in her narrow bed. They could not continue living in Milwaukee. Whatever they were, Emma's abilities had made their life in the German quarter impossible. But more troubling was the growing realization that not just observing and calculating human behavior was their daughter, but seemed to be losing touch with the emotional reality of the tragedies she predicted. To leave Wisconsin began making quiet plans by them, to find someplace where without being feared could live Emma, and where a different outlet might find her unusual mind. But with her calculations, Emma was not finished, and yet to come were the most disturbing revelations. Awake lay Heinrich that night, listening to the sounds of the German quarter settling into sleep. He could not shake the feeling that secrets that went far deeper than adultery and suicide attempts had been uncovered by his daughter's mathematical mind. All suggested that far more than anyone realized had been watched and recorded by Emma, the precision of her observations, the clinical way she discussed human tragedy, and the growing complexity of her calculations. And that she was still calculating was the most terrifying part. On the first day of May 1873 came the revelation that would expose the darkest secret of Milwaukee's German quarter. In her journal, Emma had been making increasingly complex calculations, creating elaborate charts that tracked the movements and behaviors of virtually every adult in their community. In preparation for leaving Wisconsin, hoping to escape before Emma's next prediction could destroy more lives, her parents had begun packing their belongings. But that morning, as spring sunlight streamed through their kitchen window, an announcement that would shake the very foundations of their community was made by Emma. "Papa," she said, looking up from her journal with those calculating gray eyes, "I need to show you something important. A pattern that explains everything has been revealed by my calculations." Who had been dreading this moment for weeks, Heinrich reluctantly sat down across from his daughter. To a section filled with detailed charts, maps, and numerical sequences that looked more like the work of a trained investigator than an 11-year-old child opened Emma her journal. "For 26 months, I have been observing and recording the behavior patterns of 43 adults in our community," began Emma with her characteristic clinical precision. "Initially, I believed the patterns were random variations. But when I analyzed the data systematically, correlations that indicate organized criminal activity were discovered by me." Cold felt Heinrich his blood run. "Emma, what are you saying?" With the methodical precision of a mathematics professor, consulted Emma her charts. Every Wednesday at midnight in the basement of Kellner's brewery, 7 men in our community have been meeting secretly. Based on observed deviations from normal behavior, timing inconsistencies in their stated activities, and physical evidence of their gatherings, I calculated their movement patterns. To a detailed map of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements pointed she. On Wednesday nights, Mr. Steinberg tells his wife he works late, but at exactly the same time as the other 6 men he leaves the mill and walks to the brewery using a route that avoids the main streets. For 26 months, the pattern has been consistent, with only 3 exceptions that correlated with illness or family emergencies. At the map stared Hinrich, recognizing the names Emma had marked: Wilhelm Baer, Franz Kellner, Ernst's brother, Hans Zimmermann, Franz's cousin, Otto Steinberg, Klaus Brennan, Margaret's deceased husband until 3 months ago, Gustav Wolf, and Hermann Kruger. Emma, how could you possibly know about secret meetings? I observe everything, Papa, every night, every movement, every deviation from established patterns. To another page filled with numerical calculations turned Emma. But the most significant discovery are not the meetings. Systematic theft from the brewery operations with estimated losses of approximately $47,000 over 26 months is indicated by my calculations to have involved these 7 men. Begin to tremble did Hinrich's hands. More money than most families in the German quarter would see in a lifetime represented the sum Emma mentioned. How could you calculate such a thing? With the same mathematical precision she applied to all her observations was delivered Emma's explanation. Between the reported beer production figures and the actual output I calculated based on observed deliveries, ingredients purchased, and waste disposal patterns, I noticed discrepancies. Systematic theft was indicated by the difference, but I needed to identify the perpetrators. To detailed charts tracking the behavior patterns of the 7 men pointed she. Consistent patterns of increased spending that did not correlate with their reported incomes were all shown by these individuals. Approximately $300 worth of new furniture was purchased by Mr. Weber. To relatives in Germany, Mr. Steinberg sent money. I observed him at the post office 12 times with packages too large for normal correspondence. Across all 7 men was consistent the pattern. At evidence of a criminal conspiracy that his 11-year-old daughter had uncovered through her obsessive observations and mathematical analysis was what realized Hinrich he was looking. But with her revelations, Emma was not finished. Inside knowledge of brewery security and access to the financial records was required by the theft operation, continued Emma. My calculations indicated the involvement of someone in management. As the organizer of the theft ring, the patterns pointed to Ernst Kellner himself. Like a physical blow hit Hinrich the final piece of Emma's revelation. Allegedly the mastermind of a major theft operation involving 7 men from their neighborhood was Ernst Kellner, the brewery owner who had been gradually freezing them out of the community. Incredible and terrifying was a truth that was both pointed to by the precision of Emma's analysis, the mathematical certainty of her conclusions, and the detailed evidence she had compiled through months of observation. Emma, these are very serious accusations. Are you certain of your calculations? One final time consulted Emma her journal. 96% is the mathematical probability. But Papa, there is something else. Something that explains why Mr. Kellner has been trying to isolate our family from the community. With dread felt Hinrich his chest tighten. What do you mean? That I observe everything knows Mr. Kellner. He has been watching me watch him. 3 weeks ago, twice at night he approached our house and stood outside for 17 minutes each time as if calculating whether I might have discovered his secret. That he suspects I know about the theft operation is indicated by his behavior. With a terror he had never experienced filled Hinrich the realization that not only uncovered a criminal conspiracy had Emma's mathematical abilities, but had also made her a target. One final time consulted Emma her journal. Papa, my calculations indicate that we are in significant danger. To continue making observations cannot be allowed by Mr. Kellner and the others. 84% is the mathematical probability of them taking action against our family, with peak likelihood occurring within the next 72 hours. That Emma's final prediction was not about fire or suicide or adultery, but about their own family's survival was understood by Heinrich. A truth that made their continued existence in Milwaukee impossible had been uncovered by her mathematical mind, and the one witness who could destroy them all would not be hesitated to be eliminated by the men she had exposed. That would save his family's life was a decision made by Heinrich that evening. Using the detailed evidence Emma had compiled in her journal, under cover of darkness he approached Dr. Mueller and shared Emma's discoveries. Stunned by the mathematical precision of her criminal investigation was the physician, who had already been disturbed by Emma's unusual abilities. "Heinrich, if what Emma has calculated is true," whispered Dr. Mueller as he examined the journal by lamplight in his office, "we are looking at the largest theft operation in Milwaukee's history. But more importantly, if Kellner suspects that Emma knows, your family is in mortal danger." To help them escape Milwaukee immediately agreed Dr. Mueller. Using his medical connections, for Heinrich to receive an emergency job offer at a brewery in distant Minnesota was arranged by him, providing cover for their sudden departure. That very night would they leave before Emma's 72-hour prediction could come to pass. As the Artur family loaded their few belongings into Dr. Muller's wagon under cover of darkness, one final observation that would haunt Heinrich for the rest of his life was made by Emma. "Papa, in approximately 6 months, through other means will be discovered the theft operation. Justice will be faced by Mr. Kellner, but 3 of the 7 men will not survive the investigation. Quite clear are the mathematical probabilities." As he lifted his daughter into the wagon, shuddered Heinrich. Even as they fled for their lives, the future consequences of the conspiracy she had uncovered was being calculated by Emma. In every detail would prove accurate her prediction. By winter, a federal investigation would expose the theft ring. Ernst Kellner would be arrested and convicted, and under suspicious circumstances that were never fully explained would die 3 of his accomplices. But on that dark May night in 1873, as their wagon rolled through the sleeping streets of Milwaukee's German quarter, Heinrich could only think about how both saved their lives and destroyed the only home they had ever known in America had his daughter's extraordinary mathematical mind. From Milwaukee vanished the Richter family in the early hours of May 2, 1873, leaving behind only whispered stories and unanswered questions. That they had received an emergency family summons back to Bavaria was reported by Dr. Mueller, but no ship passenger records could be found to confirm their departure from America was noted by the few people who bothered to ask. What never learned was the residents of the German quarter that indeed traveled to Minnesota had Heinrich, Greta, and Emma Richter, where work at a small brewery in the town of New Ulm was found by Heinrich. To keep their location secret had sworn Dr. Mueller, understanding that for those who feared exposure of their secrets would always make Emma a target her mathematical abilities. In New Ulm, a new life far from the whispers and fears that had driven them from Milwaukee was attempted to be built by the Richter family. Familiar and satisfying found Heinrich the brewery work, while slowly began to be rebuilt by Greta the domestic routines that had been shattered by Emma's disturbing predictions. But unchanged remained Emma herself. With the same mechanical precision that had made her both famous and feared, her mathematical mind continued to observe, calculate, and record human behavior patterns. With the family for several months maintained correspondence Dr. Mueller, reporting that with a mathematics professor at a nearby college who was fascinated by her unusual abilities had begun working Emma. The professor, a German immigrant named Dr. Hermann Weiss, from a scientific rather than supernatural perspective approached Emma's condition, helping her understand and channel her observational skills in ways that might prove beneficial rather than destructive. But in November of 1873 came the most significant revelation when a letter from Heinrich containing Emma's final prediction about the Milwaukee theft operation was received by Dr. Mueller. As she had calculated with mathematical precision, indeed uncovered had been Ernst Kellner's conspiracy by federal investigators. Arrested and convicted of embezzling over $50,000 from multiple brewery operations was Kellner. Under circumstances that were ruled a suicide, but which many suspected were something far more sinister, was found dead in his home. Wilhelm Weber, who had been Kellner's primary accomplice. Within weeks of the investigation's conclusion also died Otto Steinberg and Hermann Kruger, Steinberg in what appeared to be a drunken accident, and Kruger from what Dr. Muller diagnosed as a sudden heart attack that bore suspicious similarities to the symptoms of certain poisons. In every detail had been accurate Emma's mathematical analysis of the criminal conspiracy, including her prediction that not all of the conspirators would survive the eventual discovery of their crimes. What Heinrich had come to understand about his daughter's extraordinary and terrifying abilities was confirmed by the precision of her calculations, even from hundreds of miles away and months in advance. From the scandal and tragedy of 1873 slowly recovered the German quarter of Milwaukee. Unwelcome attention from federal authorities was brought by the brewery theft investigation, but a level of corruption that had been quietly damaging the community for years was also exposed by it. Into the houses left empty by death and departure moved new families, and around more honest foundations gradually rebuilt itself the tight-knit community. But part of the neighborhood's whispered folklore became the story of Emma Richter, the pale girl with the calculating gray eyes, who could predict death and expose secrets through mathematical observation. To warn their children about the dangers of knowing too much used her story parents, while what other secrets might be hiding behind the ordinary facades of their neighbors' lives quietly wondered adults. Who had initially blessed Emma's abilities as divine gifts, Father Koller later confessed to Dr. Mala that in ways he could not explain had been shaken his faith by the girl's mathematical predictions. Whether some knowledge was too dangerous for human minds to possess had the priest begun to question, and whether a blessing or a curse that had been visited upon their community was represented by Emma's condition. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Milwaukee's German quarter intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the most disturbing historical cases America has to offer. In the spring of 1874, nearly a year after their departure from Milwaukee, was written Dr. Mueller's final letter to the Artier family. In it, he reported that largely returned to normal had the German quarter, but that in whispered conversations among the older residents continued to circulate Emma's story. A disturbing development that had emerged during the federal investigation of the brewery theft was also shared by him. That Emma's journal, which as evidence had been left with Dr. Muller by Heinrich, contained mathematical calculations that extended far beyond the immediate criminal conspiracy had been discovered by government investigators. Throughout the entire German immigrant community, Emma had apparently been tracking and analyzing behavioral patterns, creating detailed profiles of dozens of families and predicting future events with remarkable accuracy. Both impressed and disturbed by the sophistication of Emma's observational methods were the federal investigators, trained in criminal analysis. "Your daughter's mind works in ways that professional investigators might envy," wrote Dr. Mueller. "But I confess that I am grateful she is far from Milwaukee. A kind of knowledge that I fear is too dangerous for any community to possess is represented by the precision of her observations and the mathematical certainty of her predictions." From a brief notation in the New Ulm College Mathematics Department records from 1875 comes the final mention of Emma Richter in any historical record. That his special student had demonstrated unprecedented abilities in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction was reported by Professor Hermann Weiss, but that for personal reasons had decided to relocate once again her family from history as completely as she had vanished from Milwaukee on that dark night in May of 1873 disappeared Emma Richter after that entry. Unknown remains what happened to the girl who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision. That families like the Richters possessing children with unusual abilities deliberately maintain their anonymity to protect themselves from both scientific exploitation and community persecution have theorized some researchers. One of the few documented cases where such abilities were recorded in sufficient detail to understand their scope and implications is represented by Emma's story. That the human mind remains one of our greatest enigmas is shown to us by this mystery, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that challenge our understanding of intelligence, observation, and prediction. In 1873, as either divine or demonic was seen Emma Richter's mathematical approach to human behavior. But modern science recognizes that conditions like savant syndrome, autism spectrum disorders, and hyperthymesia can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think Emma's abilities extended even further than what we discovered? Leave your comment below and let us know if you've ever encountered someone with similar extraordinary mental abilities. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. These historical cases remind us that the most frightening truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right mind to calculate their terrible secrets. That sometimes the most terrifying discoveries come not from supernatural forces, but from the relentless application of mathematical logic to human behavior is demonstrated by the case of Emma Richter. In a world where we believe our secrets are safe, the existence of minds capable of such precise observation and calculation reminds us that privacy may be nothing more than an illusion, and that to those who know how to look and how to count may be visible the patterns we think we hide.